Well, good morning, everyone. This hearing of the Subcommittee on Conservation, Energy, and Forestry to discuss the national forest management and its impacts on rural economies and communities will come to order. Let me begin by want to welcome everyone to the first hearing of the Conservation, Energy, and Forestry Subcommittee of this Congress, the 113th. Particularly want to extend a warm welcome to our new ranking member, Mr. Waltz. We're all honored to be able to serve with him in providing leadership to this committee, as well as the new members of our subcommittee. This subcommittee has broad jurisdiction over a large number of issues, areas at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, including forestry, an important topic for many of us here today. Forestry plays an important role in the rural economy. The forest product industry employs almost 900,000 people across the country, not including jobs directly supporting the industry. And in 2012, the forest products industry had an economic impact approaching $190 million. Our national forests are capable of providing and sustaining these economic benefits, but they need proper management in order to do so, which is the topic of today's hearing, the management of our national forest system and what impacts this management has on neighboring communities. The Forest Service manages more than 193 million acres of land across 41 states. Within those 41 states, there are over 700 counties containing national forest land. These communities rely on us to be good stewards of these federal lands. The people who live in those communities depend on well-managed national forests to foster jobs and economic opportunity. These jobs can come from diverse sources, such as timber, energy production, or recreation. If these jobs disappear, so too do jobs that support those industries. If these disappear, then school systems and infrastructure in these communities are certainly threatened. Thus, effective management and Forest Service decisions have significant consequences on our constituents who live in and around our national forests. When Congress created the National Forest System more than 100 years ago, it was designed so that the surrounding communities would benefit from the multiple uses. A share of the revenue from each forest activities has to be returned to the communities in exchange for the fact that these lands were taken off the local tax rolls. Additionally, these forests would provide jobs to communities by harvesting timber, collecting natural resources, or providing recreational opportunities. However, as timber outputs have declined over the last 25 years, we have seen the impacts on these communities. Unemployment is higher in these communities, and we have witnessed some of the most intense fire seasons in the last 50 years recently. I continue to be very troubled by the significant reduction in timber harvesting in the national forest. Harvesting is a critical piece of management, and the Forest Services cannot effectively manage our forests without it. To his credit, Secretary Vilsack recognized these concerns, and last February he stated his goal for the Forest Service to harvest 3 billion board feet annually by 2014. The Forest Service harvested more than 2.6 billion board feet last year, its highest total since 2000. Now, I applaud these efforts, and I hope that the agency will go farther to see harvesting levels closer to the recommended sustainable cuts in each forest. However, I hope the agency does not make a short-sighted decision to reduce treatments to national forest land in an attempt to meet the obligations of the sequester. Though it's a decision that may save a bit of money in the short term, it will only further impair the national forest system that's already dangerously mismanaged, resulting in fewer jobs, more fire-prone forests, and communities struggling to make ends meet. Sequestration is an unfortunate approach to achieve deficit reduction, but we must face reality. The federal government must shrink. We must utilize resources more efficiently and effectively. With any hope, these austerity measures will help remind us of just how critical forest management is for both federal spending and economic growth. And through better forest management, we'll spend less money fighting wildfires. Through increased timber harvest, we'll see more revenues to the U.S. Treasury and our local communities. And I look forward to hearing today from Chief Tidwell as to how the service will be managing this process. And today we're going to hear testimony about other ways the Forest Service can help promote rural economic health, including energy production, or by providing recreational opportunities in our forests. Now, I want to welcome our panel witnesses and thank them for sharing their perspectives today. I also like to especially say thank you to Mr. Ken Kane, a constituent of mine who will be testifying later this morning. And I look forward to a productive discussion on how we can be certain the Forest Service is doing everything within reason to produce a stronger rural America. Now, it's good to see Forest Service Chief Tidwell, and I welcome Chief Tidwell back before the subcommittee. He's been a great partner to work with as we share this common commitment towards healthy forests. We have enjoyed a good working relationship in the past, and I look forward to working with you to ensure that we have a healthy and prosperous rural communities across America. And now I yield to the ranking member, Mr. Wallace, for opening statement.
Well, thank you, Chairman, and to you, congratulations on assuming the chairmanship. It's been obvious since you came to Congress. You've been a champion of rural issues, rural America, and done it in a positive, visionary way. And so I'm very grateful and proud to be serving with you. I'd also like to acknowledge one of my constituents is here, Kevin Papp from Blue Earth County, Minnesota, is here. He's the president of the Minnesota Farm Bureau. He often says he's got a farm there where he raises corn, soybean, and boys. And I think that kind of sums up what we're about, of trying to make the land productive, gain the wealth for the country, and do it in a way that is managed for future generations. So, Kevin, I appreciate that. Chief Tidwell, thank you for your service to this country. Thank you for being here and sharing your expertise on many of the things that I concur with the chairman on how we correctly manage our forest resources. I, of course, represent Minnesota's 1st district. That's the deep south of Minnesota, down by Iowa. But we, as a state, have vast timber resources, 16.3 million acres of forest land. 3 million of that is national forest, 3.9 million is state forest land. Our Department of Natural Resources does a wonderful job. They're a front runner in many of the management techniques that are being developed and in forest fire suppression, so we're grateful for that. The thing that I find most interesting is that industry, the forest and timber industry, provides about $9 billion in economic impact to the state. I also represent the Mayo Clinic. That $9 billion represents about twice what the Mayo Clinic does, and that's a place that employs 40,000 people. So I think, putting it into perspective, it's a huge industry. The interesting part is it's not an all or nothing. Our recreational activities contribute $11.6 billion. So you can have your cake and eat it too if we do it right, in terms of managing these resources, using them correctly, and still being able to have the multi-use that we want to try and get. My focus, much like the chairman's, is to ensure that that federal funding for state and private forestry is well spent. Our national forests are managed in a way that meets that multiple-use mission. I'd like to today, if possible, hearing from some of you too, and Chief Tidwell, you may be the person to help me more with this, is to get a clearer picture of what sequester is going to mean. And I've been told that sequester is Latin for idiotic governance, and it may be true. My fear is that when you do indiscriminate across-the-board cuts, that where we could use smart money, we could save money in the long run. I want to hear how the Forest Service is making plans for that. So, again, to all of our witnesses, thank you. Had a chance to read your testimony. Appreciate there's a lot of expertise in this room today. A lot of it on that side of the table, so I want to hear where you're coming from, making sure we get this right, and I think certainly a renewable resource like our timber resources is one that this nation can put to good use both now and in future generations. So, Chairman, I appreciate and again congratulate you and yield back my time.
I thank the gentleman. The chair would request that other members submit their opening statements for the record so that the witnesses may begin their testimony and ensure there's ample time for questions. At this time, I'd like to welcome our first panel to the table, and our first panel is our Chief of our U.S. Forest Service, Mr. Tom Tidwell of the United States Department of Agriculture. Chief Tidwell, please begin when you're ready.
Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee, thank you again for the opportunity to present the views of the U.S. Department of Agriculture regarding the national forest management and how it benefits both the public and private land, the benefits of public and private lands on rural economies and our communities. You know, in my written testimony, I tried to share many of the benefits of the national forest, and in my remarks today, I'm going to briefly highlight a few of those key points. The benefits of the national forests and grasslands, without question, are significant to this country, and especially to rural America. For instance, in 2011, the various activities on the national forests and grasslands contributed over $36 billion to America's gross domestic product and supported nearly 450,000 jobs. Now, recreation-related activities, which support 166 million visits to the national forest, they supported a little over 200,000 jobs and about $13.6 billion to the GDP. Forest products from the national forest, they support another 42,000 jobs, another $3 billion to the GDP. Grazing, over 19,000 jobs. Minerals and energy production, about 56,000 jobs and $8 billion to the GDP. And we administer 160,000 mining claims and 2,600 mineral cell contracts. Returns to the Treasury on these lease rentals, royalties, and bonus bids, it ranges from $650 to $850 million a year. Now, especially in rural America, these benefits and associated activities, they're just essential to sustaining our communities. But in addition to the commercial activities, 20% of Americans rely on the drinking water that originates off the national forests. Our forests in this country offset a significant amount of the carbon emissions in this country, and the national forest itself, we estimate, basically offset over 4% of those emissions. Once again, on the recreation use, and it goes beyond just those numbers. I can't stress enough that I think many of you can relate to it, how many people enjoy going out and recreating on their national forests and grasslands. It's where America plays. It's where they hunt, they fish, it's where they ride their horses, their motorbikes, their ATVs. In addition to these benefits, we also administer 74,000 use authorizations that help benefit the public and local communities, such as 15,000 miles of transmission lines, 6,000 miles of energy pipelines, 1,600-mile mountaintop communication sites. And sir, I could go on and on about these benefits. But the other thing I wanted to point out is that through our state and private programs, we also help support private forest owners. In fact, we have a program with our Forest Stewardship program where we're helping private landowners with 20 million acres of private forested lands to provide them the technical assistance that they need to be able to manage their private forest lands and to keep those private lands forested. Now, all these benefits that I've been talking about, there's a threat to these benefits, and it's something we've been very clear about over the last couple of years about the number of acres that we feel that need to have some form of restoration. And we estimate between 62 and 85 million acres of our national forests are in need of some form of restoration. When you think about that, more than 60% of this country is in a moderate to severe drought, and that over the last 10 years we've had 45 million acres out west that have been affected by bark beetle, and we estimate there's another 80 million acres of trees that are projected to be at risk from severe mortality due to insects and disease. You add to that the threat of rapid escalation of the severe fire behavior that we've seen over the last 10 years. And our national forests, the benefits that they provide, really are threatened right now. And that is why we have moved out to increase the rate of restoration on these forests. And I appreciate you acknowledging the Secretary's Vilsack's support for us to be able to increase the amount of work, the restoration we're doing on these lands by 20% between last year and 2014. That includes the outputs, not only the streams that are restored, the miles of roads that are improved. It also increases timber output by 20%. It's just essential that we're able to maintain the resiliency and resistance of these national forests so that they can deal with the stresses of drought, the stresses of insect and disease, and the natural disturbances that we're seeing a significant increase year in and year out, whether it's windstorms, ice storms, whether it's flooding, whether it's fire. It's essential that we do what we can to help these forests to be as resilient as they can so they can continue to provide the benefits that we all rely on. I want to thank you for your time this morning, and I look forward to your questions.
All right, thank you, Chief. Let me take the liberty of taking the first 5 minutes of questions. Chief, within your testimony, you noted, and specifically to wildfires, that climate change and vegetation were two issues, and I can see that it's been drier, it's been hotter, and obviously if vegetation is quite frankly is not managed, the undergrowth provides just a tinderbox. Now, given the fact that we've known for some time we've had this trend of warmer summers, it seems to me the only real remediation to that is be more aggressive with harvesting. Some with stewardship contracting, but I think just green timber sales, I actually prefer that because that's got to tie back into the local communities with dollars. So we need to use both tools. Why haven't we been? What has been the obstacles to not using those tools to provide more wildfire prevention?
Well, Mr. Chairman, you're correct. We recognize we need to be doing more, and one of the ways to reduce the threat, especially to our communities, and to improve the effectiveness of our suppression activities is to get in there and reduce the amount of biomass, reduce the number of trees on these landscapes, and that's one of the reasons why we have increased our rate of restoration, increased our rate of harvest, and especially with a focus on the areas around the communities and our wildland-urban interface. So each year over the last few years, we've continued to increase the number of acres that were treated, and there's strong evidence that show that when we do that, we definitely change the fire behavior, and our firefighters are more successful. So we are moving forward with that. The challenges that we have is the amount of acres that need to be treated. And in the last few years, the markets for a lot of the saw timber that needs to be removed and the smaller diameter is that there's very little value in a lot of this timber that needs to be removed. And so that's one of the things that's slowed down the efforts, and especially with stewardship contracting, there hasn't been as many receipts available. I'm pleased to know that the prices for especially saw timber have been improving over the last year, so that's going to help us. The other thing that is really making a difference is these collaborative efforts across the country where people have come together and recognized the type of work that needs to be done on these forests, so that there is more and more support for us to be able to move forward and to be able to treat the areas that we need to treat. The thing that we've really changed over the last couple of years is to recognize we need to treat large areas. The 500 acres, the 1,000 acres, that's not enough. And that's why we put our efforts the last couple of years into doing the analysis on tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of acres at a time, so that we can treat the amount of country we need to really make a difference.
It seems like those collaborations are a way to leverage other monies, obviously, with different areas of government. And so I congratulate you for including that as part of the strategy. You talked referenced about the market, and the market is somewhat of an issue. It's obviously, and I know I'm a huge fan of our Forest research labs. These are scientists that are really doing tremendous work. I've had an opportunity to visit some of the laboratories. And I know that the Forest Service is involved in looking at nanotechnology. Are there other and they're battling invasive species. They're looking at all different types of things. Are there other? How well does the Forest research look at developing other innovations? I've got a bill that Ms. Schrader and I introduced last week, obviously, to the Forest Products Fairness Act, and that's more of a marketing to make sure that our forest products are able to benefit from that bio-preferred label. That's about marketing and expanding. But obviously innovation, looking for new markets for our forest products. How much is the Forest Service involved with that?
Well, Mr. Chairman, first I want to thank you for your support for using or finding ways to use more forest products, and whether it's in the bio-preferred markets or whatever. And I know that we're moving forward with trying to provide some additional flexibility. So I appreciate your support around the bio-preferred market opportunity. Our Forest Products Lab, they spend a lot of their time really looking at how we can not only improve the marketability of wood, but actually to create new markets. The first one is our Green Building Initiative, where we are trying to find ways to be able to create more buildings out of wood. For instance, they developed products called the cross-laminated timber, which is able to take a combination of the high-quality wood plus the lower quality wood and put it together in a way that it passes all the tests so that it's stronger than just a timber cut from a tree. And this will allow us to be able to pursue wood buildings that go beyond 4 stories, so that we can, in our commercial buildings, be able to go 5 to 6 stories, which is common in Europe, where they're moving forward in Canada. So, that's one of the things that we're moving forward with. We're also looking do a lot of research in bioenergy to be able to find ways to make it more economically viable for us to use the small diameter residual material there's no market for it for saw timber, but it too needs to be removed. And so if we can defray the costs by converting that into usable, renewable energy, it's another way that it'll make it more economically feasible for us to get this work done. It also makes it easier for the mills to be able to have a cogen plant, that they can use the energy for their operations, but ideally then put it onto the web. And so with USDA, with the Forest Service and rural development, we've had a very successful program the last year to use a combination of loans and grants and expertise to be able to create more of a demand for bioenergy. The other thing we're working on is with biofuels. And we got a ways to go yet, but our scientists are now to the point that they can produce a gallon of fuel for about $6 to $7 a gallon. We know we need to get it down to about $4 a gallon before it'll actually become economically viable. But it's one of the things that we are continuing to work on as just another way to help create more markets so that we can manage our national forests. You mentioned nanotechnology. And of everything I've talked about, it probably has potentially the highest potential. But we're still a ways away with that technology. But I wish I would have brought an example of today I can bring in here and show you a sheet that looks like plastic to me that's made out of cellulose, made out of wood cellulose. And that, I'll tell you, it's stronger and more durable than any piece of plastic that's sitting here on the desk right now. But that's the potential that we have in these other markets. That, along with being able to maintain our wood products industry, to maintain the saw timber, the sawmills in this country, that's what it's going to take for us to be able to have the infrastructure to be able to do the work that needs to be done on our forests.
Thank you, Chief. At this time, I'll yield to the ranking member.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Chief Tidwell. Again, I'm really pleased to hear you talking about this commitment on moving towards biofuels. We have, obviously, in southern Minnesota, a pretty advanced biofuels industry, and I think most of us who've watched this understand that this is an ongoing process. We're still in the infancy of this, but again, it's about providing a broader portfolio of energy uses, and I think there's folks that want to collaborate, and I'm glad to see that that's moving forward. Just a couple of questions here. In a February letter to the appropriators, Secretary Vilsack anticipated the effects of sequestration to the Forest Service wildlife fire management to be $134 million and the forest system to be $78 million. If you could verify those amounts and provide some details on how you're going to implement those cuts and what the impact will be on those programs.
Well, those numbers are correct, and I'll talk first about the 5% reduction to our fire funding. That's both in our preparedness funds and also in our suppression funds. So it will result in we're estimating maybe up to 500 less firefighters, 50 to 70 less fire engines, this year. Put that in perspective, we, just the Forest Service alone, we usually provide around 10,480 firefighters, so that would drop the number to just a little below 10,000. And so we'll start the year with a few less resources. However, we have the ability to move our resources around the country to be able to pre-position the crews, fire engines, where they're needed, ideally right before that part of the country starts their fire season. So we'll be able to mitigate some of the impacts by just moving more of the resources around.
You save much money by moving firefighters that were there from another part to put them there?
No, sir, it increases the cost. So the suppression costs will go up because when we move pre-position resources, they are then charged to a suppression code, fire code, and so the suppression codes will go up so that we can pre-position these resources. But we will respond, and we're going to do whatever we need to be able to respond to wildfires without any question.
Okay. Well, I appreciate that. A question, we all talk about it's hotter, drier, looking at some of these things. I'm of the belief that that's probably the new normal. Is there going to have to be a new way of thinking about management based on that new normal, not based on historical past trends? Is that something that's being talked about and done?
Well, sir, you're correct. It is the new normal, and I like to talk about it as just our fire seasons they're warmer, they're drier, and they're longer. In fact, often, 60 to 70 days longer today than just what they were, 10, 15 years ago. And so that's what we're up against. That stresses the need for us to be able to do the hazardous fuels reduction so that when a fire does threaten a community, that it drops out of the trees, gets on the ground so the firefighters can be successful. It also makes a safer environment for our firefighters because we will not put our firefighters at unnecessary risk. So it's essential that we move forward, and not just on the public lands, but this is an issue for all lands, and that it needs to be in conjunction with the work done on private lands. And so I tell you, it used to be, when I first started my career as a firefighter, it was seldom that we ever had to be worried about a fire threatening a building or a subdivision. Today, it's seldom that we ever have a fire that we're not also have to factor in keeping that fire away from the community.
And that's a combination of changes, but also encroachment near these lands and buffers, would you argue?
Yes. People like to live next to these lands. I understand that. And we can do that in a way, but they need to be able to treat the fuels on their private land in conjunction with us treating lands, the fuels on the national forest.
Super. My final point, and I asked, maybe this is more to think about. I'd kind of like to hear what you think. You're going to hear testimony after you, Chief Tidwell, from folks who are seeing a way of life disappear, who are seeing it more difficult to do, and we're looking for ways to make sure that we enhance that so people have the opportunities to live in these areas and to do that. What are the factors you think, in addition to what the Forest Service is doing, that are leading to that those changes, in your opinion?
Well, I think it's probably a combination of things, but there's just no question that the economic benefits that come from the economic activities off the national forests and grasslands and how they can help sustain the local economies. And as you mentioned in your remarks, from recreation, it's across the board in this country. It's a very important economic activity. And then the other parts of it is for, to manage these lands. I mean, there's studies out there now that for every $1 million that we invest in restoration activities, it creates another, I think, 12 to 20-some jobs. So we have those things going for us. The other thing that we have that's changed in just the last 5 years, where I spent the majority of my career dealing with controversy and conflict about how the national forest should be managed. And I can tell you today that's being replaced with just constructive dialogue about how and why, not should you or should you not. And because of that, I tell you, we are building support across this country where people are coming together, they want to work together. We're seeing it from communities that are willing to put their own money to help restore these lands because they recognize if they can improve the conditions of that watershed, it's going to save the city less money because when a flood occurs, there's going to be less impact. And so folks are seeing that there's a connection to maintaining these lands with direct economic benefits. And so those are the things that I think we can really start to turn this around. We just need to stay the course.
Well, I'm grateful for that, and I think it is our public land legacy is the envy of the world. So I appreciate the work you're doing. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Now I recognize the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Rogers, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hate to waste time in this hearing on a parochial issue, but apparently I have to since your staff has not been able to handle this for me. I have a church in my district called the Union Baptist Church. It's had a permit for a cemetery since 1954, less than a half an acre of land. And as late as 2009, your department confirmed their permit was still active. They've been mowing it, burying people there for years. They've sold the plots. Not all of them been filled yet, which is a good thing, but there's people that own them. They were recently notified in 2012 that their permit had been revoked. We've contacted your office, try to clear this up, and we're not getting anywhere. My question to you is, are you going to be able to take care of the Union Baptist Church Cemetery for them?
Mr. Congressman, I will personally look into that. This is a common situation throughout this country where we have cemeteries that are on National Forest System lands, and we do have some several different authorities that sometimes will help resolve this. So I will personally look into this and see if we can't use one of our existing authorities to be able to address this, and I'll get back to you.
Well, I'd appreciate it. I understand my staff has been in contact with your staff, and I understand that you may not be able to do a waiver, but we could do a land swap. The aggravating part to me is this is less than a half an acre of land they've had for 70 years almost at a permit on, and it's costing your staff more time than the land is worth to fuss over this. Just handle it. Let them swap land or whatever, but and that's also ridiculous to come up to these folks 70 years later after they've already sold the plots and say, well, you can't bury anybody there when you had permission to do it for all this time. So I'd appreciate that. I look forward to hearing back from you. My second question is a little broader. Deals with sequestration. I've got a huge national forest in my district. Mm-hmm. I'm very interested in what, if any, guidance you've been given by the administration as to how you're supposed to handle the cuts in sequestration.
Well, the 5% is across the board to each of our appropriations, and so within each appropriation, we're looking at how we can best minimize the impacts to the operations. So I've asked each of my regional foresters and research station directors to provide me with their thoughts about how they're going to reduce their planned expenditures this year by 5%. And then look at how we can, work together to, minimize, those impacts. So we're in that process right now. But, there will be impacts. The 5% for the national forests, when we look at with our trust funds, it's close to $300 million. And when I think about what I could do with an extra $300 million, and if I take it right down to your forest, what I could do if I could send an extra $3 or $4 million to that forest and how much more work they could get done, it's significant. So we're going to do everything we can to minimize, but there will be, reductions. The thing I worry the most about is with our staffing. That over the last 15 years, our fire staff has increased significantly because of the fire seasons we have. At the same time, the rest of the workforce has reduced significantly, almost 30% from where we were in the mid-90s. That's our foresters, our biologists, our engineers. It's our people that do our business, financial work. And so there's less capacity there. And so that's the thing we're really focused on, is trying not to lose any more of that expertise, because as we're trying to move forward to look at new ways to do our work, to be more efficient, whether it's improving the efficiencies of how we do our NEPA or how we are just doing our sale preparation for timber sales. It's essential that we maintain that expertise. Those are the people that I need. I need their thinking, their knowledge, their expertise.
Well, I agree with that. My concern is there's been some press reports that the administration has given guidance to maximize the pain in these sequestrations, to demonstrate to the public these cuts are unreasonable. So I'm glad to hear that you intend to minimize the effect of these cuts.
Yes, Secretary Vilsack's been very clear that he wants these cuts, of course, to be fair across the board, but he expects us to do everything we can to minimize the impacts.
That's all I have. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlemen, Gentlemen, thank you for yielding. Is there any consideration, I mean, there are certainly areas that sequestration, with the right flexibility, why would we make cuts in areas that are revenue generators? And I go right back to timber sales and all what's necessary to make those happen. Those are bringing revenue into the Treasury. That's great for the Treasury. It puts us on somewhat of a projection, hopefully maybe someday balance the budget, pay down this debt, but it also is good for, it's good for the local community. So I guess this is more of a statement than a question. I would just hope that as you look within whatever latitude you have, I used to manage rural hospitals. I never had a year where I didn't have to cut maybe 5%. It was just the way it was, given the economics of rural health care. It just makes no sense in those areas that generate revenue to make significant cuts there. So, all right. At this time, we'll recognize the gentlelady from New Hampshire, Ms. Custer.
Thank you very much, Chairman Thompson and Ranking Member Walsh, for the hearing today. I am excited to join this subcommittee and bring a New Hampshire perspective for the first time in 70 years. And I look forward to working with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle here to advance common sense solutions to create economic opportunity and support our rural communities. I also want to thank you, Chief Tidwell, for joining us today to discuss the work that you're doing in the Forest Service. I'm honored to represent a district that includes the majority of the White Mountain National Forest, which is truly a national treasure. Having grown up skiing and hiking in the White Mountains, I can attest to the recreational opportunities, and certainly for us, tourism is our #1 industry, and we appreciate the role that you play. There's also tremendous opportunity in terms of the timber industry, and I'm very excited to have recently visited the biomass plant in Berlin, New Hampshire, which is bringing back the forest services. And Secretary Vilsack was scheduled for a visit to New Hampshire today. I've just learned that might have been canceled, but it's an interesting company, Pleasant View, where they've installed a biomass wood-fired boiler system to heat commercial greenhouses. So I'd love to hear more from you about this wood-to-energy program that you're spearheading and opportunities for economic development in rural areas.
Well, Congresswoman, thank you. You just provided an excellent example of the potential to be able to help folks to be able to move forward, and sometimes it's to be able to get loan guarantees or a grant to help defray some of the initial costs. And then the other key part of it is to make sure that the wood is available so that if after they make the investment, we have to before we even work with anyone, we make sure that that there is the wood available, whether it's the pellets or the chips, to be able to continue that. The more that we can do this in various places, especially in the rural parts of this country, it really will help offset the cost of doing the work on the national forest, because it creates an additional market. And often that is the difference to make a timber sale viable or not, if they can also make use of some of this low-value material, plus the benefit of renewable energy. So throughout, with USDA, with this, our basically green energy initiative, that's what's bringing rural development, rural utilities, along with the Forest Service, the NRCS together, where we're really making a difference. And I tell you, I'm so excited about this because what we've been doing on our own in the past just wasn't getting much done. But I'll tell you, with the Secretary's direction on this, that we are really changing the amount of investment that's occurring, and the example that you're seeing now is that we're getting many of those in place. So thank you for your support and your recognition of the potential there.
Well, we look forward to many more of these programs in New Hampshire. I just had one other question, and this also relates to the sequester that has come up a couple of times, and access to recreational activities. As you know, this is the time of year that families are planning their recreational activities over the summer, camping and hiking and using the new ATV trails that we have. And again, I share my colleagues' concern about senseless across-the-board cuts. Could you comment on the impact to the public about the closure of recreational facilities this summer, and are any steps being taken to alleviate those closures?
Well, we estimate that we may need to close around 670 recreation sites. And once again, we manage over 19,000 across the country. And so what we're looking at are the areas that, the low use areas, and whether it's a trailhead or maybe it's a boat ramp or maybe it's a small campground. But once again, to really minimize, the impact. So around 670 is what we estimate, and once again, as we move forward with this, we're going to try to find opportunities with more volunteer efforts, or maybe working with the local community that they would then take on maybe the maintenance to keep the place cleaned up, that sort of thing. So those are the things that we'll continue to work forward with. But once again, there is going to be some impacts, but we'll do everything we can to minimize those.
Thank you very much, and I
thank the General Lady, and now recognize the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Tipton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate you holding this hearing. And Chief Tidwell, always a pleasure to be able to see you, and appreciate you taking the time to be able to come to our subcommittee today. In your testimony, you noted that between 62 and 85 million acres of national forest land are classified as high fire risk. And in Colorado, the Forest Service does partner with the state through the use of the Good Neighbor Policy and authority to allow greater state input and discretion in hazardous fuel treatment projects. Do you favor these types of frameworks that foster partnerships between the Forest Service and the state and local communities?
Yes, I do. I think Colorado is a great example of where we've been able to use the Good Neighbor Authority and for the state and the Forest Service to work together. And then you all have a long list of communities that have stepped up in your state that are also working with us in conjunction so that we can get more of this work done, create more jobs, but primarily to be able to improve these watersheds so there's less of an impact from the next fire season.
I noted during some of your comments to the chairman's question in regards to being able to create some economic opportunity and to concurrently to be able to increase the health of the forests, that you'd noted some of the carbon emissions that are offset by our national forests. Have there ever been a study in terms of the carbon output when we do have a forest fire?
Yes, there is. We have our research scientists have done analysis on those events too. I mean, it's part of the carbon cycle, but there's no question that if we can reduce the size of these catastrophic fires, we will, in the short term, reduce the amount of carbon emissions. It's one of the things, if we can change the fire behavior by thinning out these forests, we're still going to have fires, but they're going to burn at a much lower intensity, thus release less carbon into the atmosphere.
I know in our areas that's going to be critically important for the air quality issues in terms of some other industry as well. The impacts that we had from the fires in Colorado this past year, I think were pretty dramatic. When we are talking about being able to get in, create some of these treatments, are you a little concerned in terms of some of the management programs with road closures going on that's going to actually impact that opportunity to be able to get in and treat some of the forests?
Before we make a decision on closing a road, it's got to be a road that's not needed. So if there's a reason for us to be able to get in there to access, to be able to do treat areas, especially around our communities, that's one of the things that's factored into into that decision. We do have more roads on the national forest than we need or can afford to maintain, and they're impacting the water quality to the point where there's some places they restrict our ability to be able to manage some of the timber stands because of the amount of erosion that's coming from a road system that's no longer needed. So by making good decisions to close decommissioned roads that are no longer needed, it increases our ability to do more work. But we need to factor that in. If we need access to be able to get that work done, we need to get in there and get that work done before we make a change in the access.
And hopefully to be able to build in some flexibility into those rules as well to be able to address that. And you did note a number of the methods that are in process now to be able to create some of the economic opportunity. Are there specific changes to current rules on stewardship, contracting that you believe would be beneficial?
I'll tell you, the first thing I believe in is to get it reauthorized. I mean, it's just an important tool for us. We're doing about 25% of our work through stewardship contracts. We'll always, use our timber sale contracts, but it's a tool where there's strong support across the board for that. It creates more jobs. So the first thing would be able to get it, reauthorized so that our folks know that we're going to be able to continue to have this authority.
In your testimony, I think that you explained very clearly the degree to which active forest management is actually necessary to be able to create healthy forests. And our district, where we have one program going on in Pagosa Springs, we saw that the groundwater actually went up 15% after the forests were treated. The health of the trees returned within 2 weeks to be able to get in. But I think it's very important in Colorado with the forest public lands where they are interspersed with the state and the private lands as well, to be able to bring together a comprehensive approach to be able to deal with this patchwork that we're dealing with. And we've introduced, as I know that you are aware, the Healthy Forest Management and Wildfire Act, which is going to be very important as we approach this coming forest firefighting season, to be able to address and to be able to empower those states, those local communities to be able to play an active role, because it's not only the urban interface with wildlands, but it's also when we start to get into those deeper areas of the forest, how that impacts our water quality and ability to be able to address it. And hope that we're going to be able to count on your support to be able to push that forward. And thank you for being here. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman for yielding back, and now recognize the gentlelady from Washington State, Ms. Delbane.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Chief, for being here today and for all the work that you're doing. I come from Northwest Washington, and the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest is located in my district. And about 5 million people come annually to just that particular area, and it's comprised of about 2,500 miles of roads. In a prairie rural, there's no one stop. People are driving all over. We talked a little bit about roads before, but when we look at the impact of roads and recreation together, and how you factor that in and what you think might be the impacts on recreation, even if things are open, just physical availability to drive and get there in regions such as ours.
Well, Congresswoman, it's essential that we provide access, to these lands so that we can all enjoy them. And depending if you're just out for a hike or for hunting or just for driving. So when we go through the process with the public to determine the set of roads that we need to be able to manage the national forest and the set of roads and trails that they want to see on the land, we work together with our publics to make that determination. There's no question that we do have some roads that either need to have major work done on it or decommissioned because of where they sit on the watershed, that they're impacting our water quality. But we can do that. Sometimes that means we have to realign that road. But we do have more roads on the national forest than are needed without any question. And they are contributing to water quality. And so over the years, we continue to make decisions about which roads we need to keep open and which roads need to be decommissioned, and also the maintenance standard. We're finding that in the past, we used to maintain a lot of our roads to a much higher standard than really what the public needed. I mean, today, most people have a vehicle that's a little higher clearance, and so we're finding that they're okay driving on a rougher road as long as it's left open. We just have to make sure that there's good drainage on that road so it's not impacting the streams, the fisheries that are in that country. So those are the things that we look at to be able to find this balance between having a road system that we can maintain, that we can minimize the impacts to water quality, and at the same time provide the recreation access, the management access that we need on our national forests.
So do you think that given the sequester and lack of funds, that you will still be able to make the right trade-off because you have more roads than you need to and not impact roads that you wish you were going to be able to keep open?
And once again, the 5% cut across the board is going to, also have an effect on the planning that we do, and addressing the road maintenance is definitely going to be less, and it's something that we're going to have to, factor that in. So, but there'll be less roads that'll probably be closed this year because of that. And I'm concerned about the water impacts that can occur. So we're going to have to do our best to make the best decisions, prioritize this money where it really will buy us the biggest benefit. And that's what I have a lot of confidence in our forest staffs that they can do their very best to make the right decisions.
Okay, thank you. Slightly different question. There have been multiple definitions of biomass and also multiple definitions of sustainable and what that means. Mm-hmm. How do you view those, and are you working to help us kind of clarify and come up with a common definition for terms like sustainability?
Well, there's several definitions out there, for biomass, and especially when it comes to renewable energy. The 2008 Farm Bill, I think, had a good definition that'll work. I think it's important, as you go through your deliberations, to think about the benefits of being able to use wood off our national forests for renewable energy. And it'll never be the driving reason why we're ever doing anything on the landscape. It's not to produce energy. But by being able to make use of that renewable material for energy, it makes much more sense than to pay somebody to pile it up out there in the woods and then burn it, because that's our options. So it's one of the things I would encourage you to be careful in your deliberations about that, is that we need to think about what it takes to maintain healthy forests. The benefit, healthy forests equals clean water. Healthy forests, it equals clean air. Healthy forests provide the habitat for our species, provides for viability. So we need to be able to have the tools to be able to do that. And if we can offset the costs of managing these forests through renewable energy, I think it's a good thing to do. We need to do it the right way. But I can tell you from my view, that'll never, ever be a driving purpose of why we're doing any activity on the national forest, is to produce energy from biomass. But it is a byproduct that can really help us to be able to do the management that these lands need.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank the gentlelady. Now we recognize the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Crawford, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chief Tidwell, appreciate you being here today. I represent the 1st District of Arkansas, and the state of Arkansas has a strong forest product industry. I'm sure you know that. But always looking for ways to strengthen the industry and create new market opportunities and job creation and so on. And equally concerned that we have well-managed and healthy forests, both national and private forests. Several of my constituents have expressed some concern about the LEED standard, the system that sets standards for building construction, and obviously one of the primary wood markets. My question is, they believe that this disadvantages wood. Does the U.S. Forest Service use the LEED system for the buildings that they have?
We use the LEED system and then a couple other systems to be able to measure our, the sustainability of our buildings. And I agree with you. The LEED standard does not fully factor in the benefits of wood. And so it's one of the things we're also looking at other standards to be able to show that the buildings that we are building are, not only meet the LEED certification, but other certifications where we can stress, the benefits of wood. We think that is a better way to go forward. The challenge we have is the LEED standard is by far the best known around the world. And it's valuable to have that certification on a building, but it doesn't fully factor in the benefits of wood. And so that's why we try to use other certifications so that we capture that benefit, the life cycle of having wood in our buildings.
Given the importance of wood in the marketplace for construction, do you think that there ought to be some revisiting of that standard to try and accommodate wood products in a more competitive way?
We would like to have that certification revisit the use of wood and to fully factor in the life cycle of wood products, in buildings. And for instance, the carbon it's sequestered, and in the lumber that's in a building, we feel that should be part of what's considered to help, promote, from our view, to promote the use of wood. I think it's the green building material is wood.
Thank you. I'm going to switch gears on you a little bit. My district in Arkansas is home to Blanchard Springs Caverns, the St. Francis unit of the Ozark St. Francis National Forest. I'm sure you're familiar with both of those. And they're huge tourist attractions. I know that St. Francis unit is working with the Arkansas Parks and Tourism on the completion of a visitor center, Mississippi River State Park. I know that you've supported that. Appreciate that. Said all that to say this, it's a huge impact on our local economy. And that said, with the sequester possibly resulting in closure of 670 recreational sites, can you elaborate on what your plan is or what the guidelines would be for determining whether a recreation site might be closed?
Well, the direction we'll be giving is to, once again, to minimize the impact to the public. So we'll be looking at those lightly used recreation sites, whether it's a picnic site, whether it's a small campground, or maybe a boat ramp that just doesn't have a lot of use, and there may be another facility, a few miles down the road, to really, look at just minimizing. And then once again, to work with our local communities to see if there may be an opportunity for a volunteer group, or maybe for a county or the city that would want to take on managing, maintaining that facility, so that it can stay open. So those are the things we're going to look at. But there's just no question that there's going to be, some impacts. But we'll do everything to minimize. And I want to keep that in perspective. We have over 19,000 recreation sites on our national forests, and so we're talking around 270 spread across the 42 different states.
Okay. Has there been any kind of analysis done to measure the potential impact on those communities? Do you have anything in writing that you might be able to provide the committee?
I can just share with you we estimate that it'll result in probably a loss of about 1.6 million visits. I mean, that's the capacity, the use that occurs on these lower developed sites. As we move forward with that, and before we actually make the decision to close a site, we're going to be working with our communities, and we'll keep members of Congress informed, so you're aware of that. But that's the only information I have at this time.
Thank you, Chief. Appreciate you. I'm out of time, so I'll yield back.
Thank the gentleman and for yielding back. And now we'll recognize Mr. Nolan from Minnesota. You going to pass? Okay. We will recognize the gentlelady from South Dakota, Ms. Noem.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Chief Tidwell, it's good to see you today. Thank you for coming. I have a couple of questions I wanted to visit with you about, but one of them is regarding grazing permits. As you know, some of the responsibilities of the Forest Service is to maintain and manage our national grasslands as well. And you do that in cooperation with many of our producers who are having trouble with grazing permits because they're trying to go out there and maintain existing structures. It may be to water their cattle, fences that currently exist. And apparently with this administration, there's been a change. If they're going to disturb any kind of soil, they're facing some challenges in actually doing that work to make sure that that maintenance can happen. I'm wondering if you'll help me with this. This is a situation that didn't exist previously. It's really challenging for them to go out and graze their cattle, get water to them when the Forest Service is blocking any kind of maintenance to those structures.
Congresswoman, I'll need to meet with you to get a little more information on this. Grazing is part of multiple use, and I think our record's very strong that doing everything we can to be able to maintain that. And so, and we want the ranchers to maintain their improvements. I mean, the more water developments that we have, the more options we have, less impact. And so, I'll need to follow up with you and get a little more information so I can address that issue for you.
Yeah, let's do that. I know specifically when it comes to disturbing the soil. So if it's putting a fence in, repairing a fence, fixing a water system where they may need to put a new pipe in the ground, that's where they're running into the problem. So I appreciate your effort to help me on that. Second thing I want to talk about is the mountain pine beetle response project that we have in the Black Hills, which I feel like is very needed and necessary, and I want to thank you for your support. Secretary Vilsack recently came out and said due to sequestration, there was going to be a reduction in board feet harvested, 420 million board feet reduction in timber outputs. And I was wondering, were you consulted on that number when it was put forward, on what the reduction would be?
That number is just, it's produced with a 5% reduction in that it costs us about $65 a thousand to put up a sale. And so you just factor that across, and that's what it comes up to be, that level of reduction. The other thing I need to stress on that is that 50% of our budget that we get each year is committed to dealing with ongoing timber sale contracts or with personal use for folks that want to be able to have access to firewood and some fixed cost. So you have 50% of the budget that's available for preparing the next year's work or getting the contracts out, late this year. So 5% of that 50 is really a 10% reduction. And so those are the things that are factored into that number. The other thing I want to stress is that, our goal of getting to 3 billion board feet with a 20% reduction, improvement, to 20% increase by 2014, that's a stretch goal. We're budgeted for 2.4 billion, but we've made the commitment through some of the efficiencies that you've been so supportive of. I believe we can get to that 3 billion.
Can you use carryover funds?
I'll tell you, I'm going to use every flexibility I have to be able to continue for us to be able to move forward. But it does result in 5% less funds, and I can use the Black Hills Forest as a good example. 5% of our forest products is about $17 million. You know the difference. If we can send an extra $2 million to the Black Hills, what we can get done with that. So that's the challenge that we have, is to be able to work with this, to minimize the impacts, and still be able to go forward and get the work done. And I just want to be on record to thank you for your support for the work that's going on in the Black Hills, and especially from the state of South Dakota. To me, that's a model of really what we want to get done.
Is that something you think could go nationwide?
That's what we're moving forward with. The idea that if they can do it on the Black Hills, to have one EIS to cover 248,000 acres so that we can get in there and do the work we need to maintain the forest health, we ought to be able to do that everywhere.
Okay.
But it takes somebody to lead out. It takes support from people like yourself to be able to encourage our folks to be able to take that risk. And we're really excited now to be able to move forward with that decision.
Thank you. One more thing I want to touch on while I have 20 seconds left. I want to thank you for your investigation into the collapse of our sheep industry that we've seen in South Dakota and the prices. So I appreciate you pursuing that for us. I know in Idaho, a recent court decision maintained and ordered forest management decisions to protect some of the bighorn sheep habitat, and that is impacting their domestic sheep industry as well. Now, is that something that's going to stay isolated to Idaho? We're not going to look at that kind of a decision being spread nationwide and impacting our sheep industries across the country, will we?
Well, we look at every situation separately. We've also, in the state of Wyoming, have had a different outcome from how we've been able to work with the state there in Wyoming to address the same problem. So I think there's different solutions, to this problem of being able to find a way so that domestic sheep grazing can continue, along with maintaining our bighorn sheep. I mean, there's a lot of folks who like the bighorn sheep, whether to hunt or just go out and look at them. But we got to find a way to be able to do both. And I think from what we've been able to work out in the state of Wyoming is maybe a better approach than where we ended up in Idaho. But we still want to move forward in Idaho to be able to do everything we can to maintain our sheep industry.
Thank you. Thank you.
I thank the gentlelady. Now it's my honor to recognize a gentleman who was a former member of this subcommittee, and my first 2 years in the chair, he had my back at my side. Now he's still got my back with his picture behind me. But the gentleman for Virginia, Mr. Goodlatte, is not currently a member of the subcommittee, but has joined us today, and I've consulted with the ranking member, and we're pleased to welcome him to join in the questioning of witnesses today. Mr. Goodlatte.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it's an honor to be back on this subcommittee. In fact, when I served as chairman of the subcommittee that then had jurisdiction over forestry, we did not have near as much interest and representation from people all over the country in forestry issues. In fact, the chairman of the full committee told me that he had a town in his district in West Texas that was called No Trees, Texas, and so he gave me a lot of latitude on forestry issues. So I really appreciate your extending that to me as well. And Chief, we're delighted to have you with us here today, and we thank you for your efforts with our national forests. I have a lot of forest land in my district. In fact, probably 2/3 of my district is covered in forests, and about half of that land, or 1.4 million acres of national forest land in the George Washington and Jefferson National Forest. So in some respects, it's a lot like a western district in southwest Virginia. The George Washington National Forest has been leading an effort to do an update of their plan. Yes. And this has already been a multi-year process. What can you tell us about the effects of sequestration on further delays in that plan?
Well, Congressman, we're going to do what we can to minimize those impacts, and especially to be able, with the forest plans that we have started, to be able to complete those. I look at that 5% reduction. It will affect new starts, but I feel it's essential we move forward and finish these plans that we started. The public has spent a lot of time working with us, and I think it's essential we get those completed as quickly as we can. So I'm looking at it'll probably reduce the start of some new plans under the forests, but we'll maintain our efforts that we have ongoing.
So we should expect a plan sometime in the near future on the GW.
Yes.
The last release of the draft George Washington National Forest Plan caused concern among many, since the plan had a ban on horizontal drilling. I think that is questionable whether there are any recoverable resources in the George Washington National Forest, but there's a lot of concern about the precedent that this would set for other forest plans in other parts of the country. There are lots of national forests that have extraction of natural gas and oil as a part of the multiple use purpose of our forests. And I'm very concerned about the precedent that might be set there. And horizontal drilling is actually a very environmentally sound way to extract resources, because it involves drilling fewer wells and then using lateral drilling efforts to extract from a broad geographic area with minimal impact on the surface. And there are environmental issues with regard to that, but they are addressed well in many places. And I just want to get some assurance from you that the Forest Service will look for other ways to ensure the environmental soundness of these efforts than a simply blanket ban on horizontal drilling in one of our forests.
Yeah, what you see in the draft plan reflects what the forest has heard from the communities, and I think it's driven by a concern sometimes of the unknown about horizontal drilling, along with the fracking that's now becoming we're seeing more and more of that. But you're right, we've been doing this type of oil and gas operations in this country for decades, and we know the industry knows how to do it correctly. I think there is some opportunity to provide some reassurances to the public along the lines of the rule that the BLM is proposing that would require for the proponents or the oil and gas companies to disclose what chemicals they're using to ensure that flow back off of these wells is contained either into a pond or some type of a container so it doesn't pollute surface waters, to ensure that the well casings are designed correctly and implemented correctly. I think some of those reassurances, those are the sort of things I think that will help our communities understand that this type of operation can be done in a way that's environmentally sound. And I think that's the thing that we want to continue to work on, is to really address what is the concern behind when we hear folks say, well, we don't want you to allow any horizontal drilling. For us to really think about, okay, what is the real concern? And then is there a way that we can address that concern so that they feel better?
Well, thank you. I'm glad to hear that. I agree with that There are legitimate environmental concerns, and you need to have a good regulatory process. Disclosure of the chemicals used in the process are certainly good, but a blanket ban on a technology that's good and actually used correctly is environmentally very sound is a mistake, and I would hope that the future plans would reflect something that would be compatible with all the different forest plans and the need to have this multiple use in our forests where it's appropriate. And as I say, so far it hasn't been done in the George Washington National Forest, but I don't think we should set a precedent here that would create a difficult situation across the country. And Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for your allowing me to participate today.
My pleasure. Thank you. Chief, I just want to follow up Mr. Gillette's line of questioning and then just bridge that to one final question. Obviously, we know what the sound science is in terms of oil and gas production, horizontal drilling, hydrofracking. Certainly, if you run into those folks who are just not confident because they don't know, this is new to them, invite them to the Allegheny National Forest. Okay. You know, it was an oil and gas, it was not just timber rich, and we have some of the best timber. We're real proud of the timber that's there. That's why we need good management. We don't want to lose that hardwood cherry to something else. It's one of the most, I understand, despite its size, it's one of the most profitable forests for the Forest Service in the country.
Yes, it is.
But it was an oil and gas field as well, those that exist concurrently, as well as all other multiple uses. And so I want to help make your job easier. So if you get those doubters, they want to come visit the Allegheny National Forest, I'll be glad to join them in the forest. We can. Anytime I can get the time to spend in the ANF is a good day for me. So I just extend that as a resource for you, because it's not a matter of may have or possibly can be done. It's let's not talk about it in terms of speculation, because we've been doing it for decades in the Allegheny National Forest, and you can't find a more beautiful place to. I'm a little biased, obviously, to visit and to spend time. I know that one of the biggest problems we have, and this is my opinion, I'm not expecting you to go on the record with this and weigh in on it. I do have a follow-up question I'm looking for an answer from. You know, the biggest problems we have, the biggest threats that we have to unhealthy forests and therefore unhealthy rural economies, rural communities, are the lawsuits by environmental groups. They've had environmental groups, unfortunately, have had a completely contradictory outcome on our national forests with all the actions and the lawsuits that they filed. They've actually created unhealthy forests, because I know that that has really stood in the way of a lot of the management practices the Forest Service knows that are based on sound science to keep our forests healthy and therefore our rural economies. As a part of that, the federal government, in a broader sense, has contributed to that. We've allowed the Equal Access to Justice Act to be abused. That was originally designed to help those who have a stake in the game. Those folks who are property owners, where the federal government was impinging upon their rights, their property. Obviously the federal government's got the resources of every pocket of every taxpayer in this country. It's deep, rather, a lot of pockets, maybe not so deep, but a lot of them. And that's why the Equal Access to Justice Act was created. It's been hijacked, I believe, by groups who now use it to fund very specific their purposes and missions and they're not key stakeholders. They don't have direct interests in terms of ownership of properties. Do we know how much money the Forest Service has paid from agency budgets in attorney fees? And not just our agency, I know, not just the Forest Service, I know the Justice Department gets involved with this. They have a lot of lawyers over there. But do we have any idea of how much has been paid in attorney's fees through the Equal Access to Justice Act in the last 5 years to environmental groups dealing with grazing decisions or, quite frankly, forest decisions? I know we were into a battle that there was, that I think after 3 appeals by the Forest Service and others, I hope they finally have given up on, in terms of infringing on the subsurface property owners' rights up in the Allegheny National Forest.
Mr. Chairman, I can tell you what what the Forest Service has paid out in the EJA fees, and it averages about $1.2 million a year. We can actually provide you for the last 5 years.
That'd be great.
I don't have the information from the Department of Justice, but we can provide that. But that's on average. It's been about 1.2 million. For me, the solution is our collaborative efforts. Because I tell you, I've just seen time after time where the people that, because of their concerns, would turn to litigation. Those same people today are sitting at the table working with industry, working with county commissioners, to find ways for us to be able to move forward. And I tell you, that's what we're going to continue to focus on. And the more that we can do there and reduce, some of these conflicts, the better off all of us are.
Right. Well, one of the indicators, measurements to monitor that is to see if that 1.2 million decreases at all. I hope it does. Chief, thank you so much for your testimony today and for being with us, and thanks for your leadership with U.S. Forest Service. Greatly appreciated.
Thank you.
And now I'll ask that all the four panelists, or I believe 4 panelists, for the second panel, to please make your way up to the table, and we'll prepare for
Yeah, I'll go ahead and take that.
for our second panel. Just brief introductions. I want to welcome our second panel witnesses to the table. We're going to be joined by Dr. Charles Makita, the Chief Economist, Forrest Econ Incorporated, out of Moscow, Idaho, on behalf of the Society of American Foresters. Dr. V. Alaric Sample, President of the Pinchot Institute for Conservation here based in Washington, D.C. Mr. Kenneth Kane, a constituent of mine, who's President of the Generation Forestry Incorporated of Kane, Pennsylvania, on behalf of the Association of Consulting Foresters of America, and Mr. Jim Schuessler, Executive Director for the Forest County Economic Development Partnership in Crandon, Wisconsin. Looks like we're all seated. So, gentlemen, you got a chance to watch the last, there are the lights there, the green, the yellow, the red. We're going to, each of you will have 5 minutes for your testimony. All members have a copy of your written testimonies, just so that you're aware. Dr. Makita, please begin when you're ready.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Charlie Makita. I'm a professor emeritus from University of Idaho and a consulting natural resources economist. Today I represent the Society of American Foresters with 1,200 forestry professionals who are members. They all believe in sound management and stewardship of the nation's public and private forests, and so we'd all like to see the federal forest restored to health and contributing efficiently to serve national and local interests. Our question is, how can national forests use known economic linkages between them and natural resource communities to mutual advantage? I'm kind of a gearhead, and so what I'll do is I'll share some of my findings that will help identify complementary economic opportunities from forest restoration. I gave similar testimony last March to the United Nations because they're trying to use forestry for economic development as well. The first point is that the national forests have some economic power, and at the resolution of region and local, when the Forest Service acts, it changes the markets for resources, and it changes the market for the labor and the community services, even though it does so unintentionally. The trade linkages in these societies means that these ripples get distributed across economies. We have the technology to be able to identify and predict where the ripples will lay. I've studied the market and community effects of forest policy changes since the early 1970s. We've got specialized techniques that allow us to do this, and with few exceptions, what we have found since the 1990s is forest policy changes from the national forests generally have negative economic effects. However, 4 impact analyses that we've completed, all set in Oregon most recently, are starting to demonstrate positive opportunities. I looked at the Bureau of Land Management Western Oregon plan. We found that when they were going to increase timber supplies 200 million board feet a year, that their 75% fund returns to the O&C trust counties would be significant. They would accrue in patterns that we could predict, and they could almost offset their expected sunset losses of the Secure Rural Schools Act funds, but that varied a lot by county. The most interesting finding was in Portland, Oregon, which thought it was not a timber community until we showed that it was the trade center for 34 timbered counties in 4 states. People don't know their linkages to forests. Our 2012 Oregon report, we found out why the timber industry had contracted and how much it had contracted. There's still a major sector, about $12.9 billion a year, and they are recovering. Some counties have as much as 30% of their economic base tied directly to timber. The National Forest is a big player acreage-wise, about 60%, but a small player production-wise, only about 12% of the harvests across Oregon. There's bottlenecks to recovery in mill capacity, labor, and public timber supplies. The more interesting one is our analysis of forest restoration in Northeast Oregon. We found that there is about 1.4% of the Eastern Oregon land being updated and restored, and the gains do accrue in those regions, but they vary a lot by region, but they vary also by what is done. They range from 15 jobs per $1 million spent to 132 jobs per $1 million spent between a watershed project or a stewardship project. And we found that the national forests are dependent on private labor, machinery, and markets to succeed. There are avoided costs of about $1.40 in fire losses for every $1 of of restoration spent. And there's avoided costs in unemployment of about $16,000 per job formulated. But to scale up, you need expanded acceptability, expanded activity, more efficient national forest projects, and get rid of the bottlenecks in private infrastructure and the markets for biomass. I am available for questions or clarifications on these points. So on behalf of the Society of American Foresters, thank you for this opportunity.
Dr. McKenna, thank you. I apologize for the pronunciation of your name. I find there's only one thing we come into this world and leave it with, and that's our name, and I hate screwing them up. Thank you for your testimony. Dr. Sample, go ahead and proceed whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm Al Sample. I'm a forester and since 1995 president of the Beetle Institute here in D.C. Yep. Sorry, didn't hit the button. Most of my testimony will be submitted for the record, so I just want to sort of cut to the chase here. We've talked a little bit about stewardship contracting this morning. And one of the things that I would suggest to you and the other members of this committee is the enactment of permanent authority, reauthorization of the existing authority for stewardship contracting is probably the single most effective thing that Congress can do to strengthen this relationship between national forest management and the communities that depend on those forests and provide a lot of the support for or work for those forests. The relationship between communities and the national forest is very much like the symbiotic relationship that we see in nature. We've got two entities that depend on one another to the extent that if one fails, the other's not going to survive very long. And up until early 1990s, when the timber sale program was significantly reduced on the national forests, there were a lot of activities, watershed protection, activities, road maintenance, which goes along with that, wildlife habitat improvement. There was a large range of things, including hazardous fuel treatments, which we've referred to a number of times here today. And all of these were accomplished through requirements that were in the government's contracts that they issued to the timber sale operators. With the decline in those timber sales, a lot of those things didn't get done. And the first thing that really sort of hit the wall was road maintenance. And what happened was a lot of these roads began to erode and contribute sediment and debris into streams, in many cases the very streams where the Forest Service was under court order to protect habitat for endangered fish species. Stewardship contracting was something that was developed to really address that. And we began with a small number of pilot projects. Eventually, Congress authorized 83 different pilot projects. All of those were monitored very closely with multi-party monitoring teams at the community level. In 2003, based in part on the success of those early pilot projects and the reports that were developed and submitted annually to Congress on what was happening with those, convinced Congress to go ahead and authorize that across the National Forest System and also extend that authority to the Bureau of Land Management. That was 2003, and that authority expires September 30th of this year. I think I won't repeat a lot of what the Chief covered in his testimony, but this has been an extremely effective way for the Forest Service to work with the kind of small businesses that really characterize most of this capacity that we have for doing forest management that exists in rural communities. The multi-year aspect of this gives them an opportunity, and frankly, their bankers an opportunity to have the confidence to invest in equipment that tends to be very expensive, but also to invest in employment and in training of those employees, and to develop and maintain the kind of capacity at the local level that the Forest Service itself needs in order to do these sustainable forest management activities. We've talked a lot about timber, but there's a lot more that goes on in these stewardship contracts. In fact, timber is very, actually, merchantable timber is a very small part of that. We've had allusions here this morning to the effects of climate change, this warming and drying trend in the interior West, but also actually even heavier precipitation, more of that coming in the form of severe storm events in the northeastern region of the United States. So it's not just about drought. It's about the role of these forests in providing flood mitigation, stormwater management, protecting water quality and water supply. So I think I'll stop there and yield the rest of my time to my fellow witnesses.
All right, thank you, Dr. Sample. Now it's my pleasure to once again introduce a constituent of mine, consulting forester and a friend from the Pennsylvania 5th District, from Kane, Pennsylvania, Kenneth Kane, who I've always been admirer of Ken's involvement in the community, not just knowing the forest industry, but 30 years as a school board member and involved in every good cause that there is in that part of our Pennsylvania. So, Ken, please recognize you for your testimony for 5 minutes, and welcome to Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a pleasure to be here. Members of the committee, I'm here today on behalf of the Association of Consulting Foresters of America. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to offer the consulting forester's perspective on a national forest management and its impact on rural economies and communities. The Association of Consulting Foresters offer services to private landowners, forest management consulting services. We manage in 45 states about 75 million acres. Essentially, the Association of Consulting Foresters are the boots on the ground foresters for the private landowner. Our services are wide and varied. It's a pleasure to offer a national perspective from our association because we have members across the landscape. The primary issues that we'd like to address is there's pressure from local taxing entities on school districts, counties, and townships that are adjacent to national forests. There's a significant and growing problem caused by insects, disease, and fire coming from delayed management on the National Forest. And the response to salvage operations from national disasters such as wildfires and storms is slow. And the resulting change in forest composition reduces wildlife habitat. From a local perspective, I'm going to share with you the problems faced by a small community such as Kane on the Allegheny Plateau. What the Allegheny Plateau is a 16 million acres of timber, primarily forest type. It's a unique forest type comprised mostly of cherry, ash, tulip, poplar. And 16 million acres on the entire globe. That's a pretty unique ecosystem. And the small community of Kane was developed to develop those resources. And you can see when they were developed in the early part of the 20th century, the harvesting was quite intense. And it was harvested by local barons such as the Central Pennsylvania Lumber Company and Collins Pine, and they used railroads to access the timber. And the harvesting, as you can tell, was pretty intense. And those railroads today provide recreational access, hiking trails, off-road vehicle trails, and different things. So there's quite an opportunity there. The Weeks Act provided the Allegheny National Forest to be established in 1923. And what you're seeing before you is what the condition of the National Forest was in an area called Little Arno in 1927. The next slide is 1928. That's the first harvest on the ANF. The next 70 years through the series of slides will show you the growth and development of that forest, how different silvicultural treatments, and just by leaving the forest grow over a period of years, will create a very mature and healthy forest system. You'll notice that in the slides from 98 to 2000, from 88 to 2008, the change in the forest hasn't been as significant as the previous 60 years. That's because the forest is approaching maturity. And with that maturity causes a risk for blowdown. And the productivity of the forest, when it should be higher, has dropped. And from 85 to 94, the forest produced about 60 million feet of timber a year. We don't want to talk about extraction. We'd like to talk about acres treated, but we have the volumes to talk about, so we have to stay with that subject. But since then, it's tipped over. And when it should be developed and managed for local communities to support our schools and townships, it's tipped over, and the delayed response has reduced the amount of revenue from that forest to create a habitat, as you see in the next two slides, similar to what it looked like when it was established. So management on this forest and the value of this forest at one time provided essentially more money than the entire Region 9 needed to operate its entire budget came from the Allegheny. So we have an opportunity, as I hear concerns of sequester. If we put the money to the Allegheny to truly do what could be done there, we could stimulate the federal budget to help offset some of the Forest Service challenge to the future. Because by supporting the forest and sound management, which is good science, it also supports the local communities. And the one thing I would ask as we talk about stewardship is if we could consider putting some of that stewardship money back into those local communities. Put it back into the 25% fund, because then we would stimulate local communities. And I haven't even addressed the diverse resources of oil and gas in our region, which is also the bridge that we have to the future of America's energy independence. But I thank you for the privilege to be here, and on behalf of the Association of Consulting Foresters and my new company, it's a privilege. I welcome any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Kane. Now I yield to a gentleman from Wisconsin for the purpose of an introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a real privilege for me today to introduce a fellow Wisconsinite. Jim Schuessler serves as the Executive Director of the Forest County Economic Development Partnership, a public-private partnership in northern Wisconsin that works to improve the standard of living and quality of life for the citizens of Forest County. Jim holds a Bachelor of Science degree from the University of Wisconsin-Platteville. After receiving his degree, he spent 2 decades in television and ultimately served as Executive Vice President of the Broadcast Group. After selling the group in 2002, Jim purchased a tourism-based business in northern Wisconsin. He successfully operated that business until he joined his current organization in 2011 to give back to his community. With all due respect, Mr. Schuessler, you've been giving back to your community for much longer than that. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Jim and his organization have done important work for the people of northeastern Wisconsin. I'm looking forward to hearing his remarks and the perspective he'll provide. Jim, thanks for being with us today, and you can continue.
Thank you, Congressman Ribble.
Go ahead, Ms. Schuessler. We look forward to your testimony here. All right. Thank you.
Chairman Thompson, thank you. Distinguished members of the subcommittee, my name is Jim Schuessler, and I serve as Executive Director for Forest County Economic Development Partnership. The stakeholders of FCDP include the City of Crandon, the Forest County Board of Supervisors, the Forest County Potawatomi Community and Foundation, the Forest County Chamber of Commerce and Tourism Commission, the Sakaugan Chippewa Community, and the Wabeno Chamber of Commerce. Our mission is to foster an increased and diversified tax base and improve standard of living and quality of life for all the people of Forest County. I know I'm not the first person to appear in this place and tell you that all's not well in our national forests. However, let me relate from an economic perspective, a 120-year review in about 5 minutes, the good, the bad, and the opportunity. After the cutover and failure of forests, then farms, Forest County had a few choices. Number one, they could do nothing. Number two, they could work with the Wisconsin Conservation Commission and reforest. Or number three, federal forest. In November of 1927, the board voted 17-2 against federal forest. They received a lot of outside pressure, and the board relented and opened the matter to a county-wide referendum. On March 14th of 1928, Mr. L.A. Neep of the United States Forest Service appeared in Crandon for a presentation to the electorate. He promised a lot: jobs, low-cost material, and revenue sharing, a lot of other things too. Just days later, the electorate voted by nearly a 3-1 margin and bet the farm on the United States of America. In the decades that followed, the United States Forest Service delivered on all their promises. These people are heroes. Citizens and industry thrived. Connor's Leona Mill became the #1 producer of hardwood in the world. In the 1980s, the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest alone output 150 million board feet per year. Then the bad, the lawsuits, the underfunding. Raw material production declined sharply. As a result, a once thriving economic cluster began to crumble. Tribal communities and towns are getting creamed. An economic disaster has occurred in the national forest. To date, over 4,000 direct jobs in forest products have been lost in the Chequamegon region alone. Outmigration has cost the loss of future generations. All of this is outlined in my exhibits. The Leona School District, located in a Norman Rockwell-type town, is on the brink of collapse, which will fuel a domino effect over the entire region. Declining demand for forest products, hardly. Local industries could add additional shifts if the raw material were available. As a matter of fact, American imports of Canadian wood pulp and pulp wood have increased 50% over the past 10 years. Exhibits H, I, and J display the significantly high unemployment rate in the counties of the Chequamegon vis-a-vis the rest of the state. Landscape level sustainable forestry must be restored within the national forest. In the Chequamegon alone, it's conceivable $100 million could be added to the United States Treasury over the next forest plan. In addition, another $30 million to local governments. Imagine the impact to our economy. Movement toward the allowable sale quantity will result in over 4,000 jobs in the region of the Chequamegon. The harvest levels would still be well below those of the 1980s. 4,000 jobs is an auto plant, folks. I know Dr. Benishek is chairing another subcommittee this morning, but somebody please pass along to him that within the Ottawa, there's an environmentally friendly auto plant ready to be unveiled there as well. Some of our national forests are disaster areas. This is not a slam to the current chief. It's a crisis that's been decades in the making. However, the United States Forest Service desperately needs a crisis manager to support his efforts. This crisis has clobbered the local economy and will kill schools. And without a Hurricane Sandy-type sense of urgency and focus, it's going to happen. And while secure rural schools is appreciated as we emerge from this crisis, we don't need social welfare. The jobs are there. The demand is there. $100 million to the Treasury. Somebody please tell Congressman Ribble when you get back to the Budget Committee, please let him know we got $100 million for him. Another $30 million to local government. Thousands of jobs. Remember the old question, if a tree falls in the woods, does anybody hear it? We can really update that today.
that if thousands of jobs are needlessly lost in the national forest, is anybody willing to listen and do something about it? I look forward to your questions, and please know that FCEDP is ready to partner and assist in repairing the ecological and economic disaster by developing jobs and restoring a beautiful, well-managed national forest. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Schuessler. I'm going to recognize the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Ribble, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your flexibility this morning with what is turning out to be a very hectic day for this Budget Committee member as well as a member of the Ag Committee. Mr. Schuessler, thank you again for coming. I want to thank all the panel for spending some time. I do have a couple questions for both you and Mr. Kane this morning. I just want to read a quote from your written testimony. It is no accident that, through the success of the National Forest Program, a family-owned sawmill utilizing the forests of Forest County became the largest hardwood sawmill in the world by the 1940s.
That's correct.
What's happened to that sawmill?
Well, it's a travesty, and there are still people working there today. But if you take a look at it, Exhibit E, I took a couple shots on Monday morning, and I apologize for the darkness of it and the snow. We had snow Sunday night.
It is Wisconsin.
And it's Wisconsin in March. We had snow, and then, of course, the time change kind of hit me there, so it was a little bit early in the morning. But this is, the Connor Mill has a 400-acre lot in the town of Leona, right in the center. You know, originally it was the company town. They should have, by the time of breakup, about 2.5 million board feet. Now, I'm not a forester, you know, and some of you guys that come from that area can probably tell me, but I'm told that's about 2, maybe 3 weeks' work. 2.5 million board feet can't be found anywhere. The product just isn't there. People are going to be out of work. The layoffs have already started.
The trees are there, aren't they?
Absolutely. Okay. They're tipping over.
In your testimony, you also noted that the decline in timber harvesting in Wisconsin has resulted in roughly 4,000 job losses in the 11 national forest counties. I'm interested in hearing about how you arrived at that figure. Additionally, you noted that at its peak, Wisconsin's national forest produced 159 million board feet of timber in a single year. Do you believe we can ever accomplish that again?
I'll take them in order. First of all, I am blessed by being surrounded by skilled foresters and silviculturists in my region. It is not my background. There are a couple people, Dick Krause, who's a very seasoned veteran, and a retired United States Forest Service, and a second person who retired United States Forest person, got together and really put together, using today's technology, how many board feet equals a job. And they came to the conclusion, looking at the technology that exists today and the things that we use out in the woods, that about 20,000 board feet equals a job. So taking from that the fact that we're down over 80 million board feet in the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest, we've lost over 4,000 direct jobs. Could you repeat the second question?
Yeah, the second question was regarding the 159 million board feet that was being harvested. I wanted to know if you think we can ever get back to that.
I can't imagine, and I can tell you that Forest Service employees can't imagine it. I was up in the Washburn about a week ago, meeting with the regional forester up there, a very dedicated employee who's doing some great things on stewardship that we'd like to bring back to the east side of the Chequamegon. I related that to her, and her experience, as I understand it, goes back to the 80s. And when I related to her the kind of harvesting levels that existed back then, she couldn't even fathom it. So it's really moved outside the DNA. Allowable sale quantity, ASQ, is something that's not looked at. It's just sort of this number that's out there. And so it's going to require a remarkable change in thinking to take folks back to those times. Certainly the demand is there, though.
And I can tell you, as someone who has spent my entire life in construction, it troubles me greatly that I see so much imported timber from Canada while we have foresters not working in Wisconsin.
And skyrocketing prices.
This is a problem. And Mr. Kane, thank you for coming. And I really enjoyed the photos of Pennsylvania. What a beautiful place that you live. Almost as beautiful as northern Wisconsin. It's good to see here. In your testimony, I quote, there's a significant and growing problem caused by insects and diseases coming from non-managed national forests. I'm curious about the word non-managed national forests. What do you mean by that?
Interesting. In that part of the national
microphone.
Excuse me. Part of the national forest system is wild areas, scenic areas, and natural areas. Just outside the community of Kane is the Tynesta Scenic Area. It's a 500-acre area of old growth consisting primarily of beech. And the beech is decadent because of the beech scale nectar complex, which is a whole other story that I won't go into. But in 1991, it was identified that a native insect, the elm spanworm population, was just growing out of proportion because of that beech ecosystem created the perfect habitat for elm spanworm development. We pointed out to the Forest Service because it was a natural area, they couldn't do anything about it. In 1992, it spread outside of it. It's kind of a ripple of a stone in a smooth pond. It went outside that area, and the Forest Service still was unable to do anything about it. Its natural insect's going to collapse. 1993, it was larger, encompassed essentially the entire Allegheny Plateau. We had to pull 10 different organizations, consulting foresters that compete with each other daily. 5 sawmills that compete with each other daily formed a consortium. We sprayed over 100,000 acres in 1994 at a cost of over $1 million. That's something that could have been stopped in 1992 for 10% of that investment. That type of thing.
Mr. Chairman.
That's the prime example.
Could you yield another 30 seconds?
Without objection.
Okay, thank you. I just want to follow up on that because I think the American people, if they were listening to this, would be surprised by this. We've got the National Forest Service there to manage them. Are there regulations that are preventing them from taking care of this? Or something outside stopping them because it defies belief that they wouldn't want to stop it?
Ironically, there are regulations. They can't operate in the natural area. There's regulations that prevented them from getting the bullseye. But when it had spread out, it was a natural insect with minimal experience because it always collapsed. But because we provided the right habitat at the right time, a natural insect became quite the crisis. The ironic part, in 1994, the Forest Service also had a spray program for the elm spanworm.
All right. Thank you very much for your testimony today. Thank you to the panel. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thanks, gentlemen. I recognize Ms. Waltz, Ranking Member, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you all for your testimony. It's very insightful and very helpful. Dr. McKenna, I was especially interested in your work of this linkage issue to regional communities and trying to understand this. And I think what I'm trying to do here is listening to what you say and what Mr. Schuessler says. You had a quote, Dr. McKenna, economic power of the National Forest Service has unintentional and inept in some of the ways, and it was a monolithic entity. My question, I guess, to the both of you is, Dr. McKenna first, do you anticipate with changes to the Forest Service, as you heard, that we would return to the historical patterns and those economics, because in many of these communities, they're very undiversified, if what I'm hearing is correct. If the Forest Service policies have decimated communities based on that, is there a guarantee that if we change those rules that we will go back to historical patterns?
In fact, one of the hardest messages that I have to give my clients is that the historical pattern is something that we will never return to. Particularly if you look in the western states, we have seen concentrations of industry, a movement of labor away from the forest, so that what happens when the forest does need labor, it often has to jump those communities. It has to jump for equipment and infrastructure as well. The Forest Service has always had the capability of measuring the impact of their actions. Although they do not recognize their monopoly powers in these small areas, they have modeling that does show the impacts. However, we very rarely see that as a primary criterion in the forest planning process. It's only recently that we've started to see in the forest restoration activity, and my experience is limited to the Northwest, where we're starting to see intentional connections of stewardship projects to particular groups within the impact areas to mutually benefit from those kinds of investments. In order to expand that, the Forest Service could expand its activities a little bit, but not to its historical levels, because it is now constrained by things that didn't exist in 1980.
That data would be valuable to someone like Mr. Schuessler, because I don't know if I'm interpreting right. Is it your contention, Mr. Schuessler, that the policies that you described as a catastrophe or that's happening with the Forest Service, if they were doing things differently in your mind, you would see a resurgence approaching historical economic growth?
Absolutely. A great part of that economic cluster that feeds that industry still exists. It just deteriorates as years go by. So a lot of those people have gone to the city, they've gone elsewhere, but really their home's back where they come from. And a lot of them, I think, would return if the jobs were there.
If you had the magic wand, what three things would you do?
I think the first thing I would do is hire a crisis manager to come in and do an assessment of the harvesting that could immediately take place. Remember, harvesting is ultimately a regenerative treatment. We can't get the undergrowth if we don't get that old stuff.
And you don't believe they're doing that?
Out of the way. It doesn't exist. I was in the Ottawa last Thursday. Again, not a forester, not a silviculturist, but what I saw there, and I've got it in one of my exhibits here, is I took a shot of a row of logs that have been cut out of there. It's supposed to be saw log. It's a junkyard. It's all overly mature. I'm told 20 years ago this would have been wonderful saw log. And the problem is, some of these things, the pulping mills, they're over 30 inches. They should have been kept as a legacy tree because the pulping mills won't even take them. It's literally junk out there.
What's your belief of why that doesn't happen? Why hasn't it happened?
Well, for one thing, we're not sustainably managing those forests fast enough. I think Dr. Benishek would be livid if he saw what I saw last Thursday, because it's in his own backyard.
You think they're ignoring it, or they don't have the right data, or they're choosing to make a decision that is detrimental to the local community? What's your assessment of why, with their expert opinion, that they're not doing that?
The Forest Service tells us that they're underfunded for putting those regenerative treatments out there. And certainly the lawsuits had a lot to do with it. People had these unintended consequences of these lawsuits ended up slowing down these timber sales, and the treatments couldn't take place.
My final question, Dr. McKenna, you talked about needing the political will in these. What did you mean by that, in the political will?
When I look at the potential versus the actual restoration job, right now, the example we have is from eastern Oregon. About 1.4% of the forest is being treated. There is difficulty matching the output of the Forest Service to the people who would utilize it and finding the labor. If this was expanded and you had some kind of a contracting structure which would allow a simultaneous expansion of the private infrastructure, because nobody's going to invest in something that's uncertain. You need a symbiotic relationship, as Dr. Sample pointed out, in the planning process to look at the Forest Service objectives and intents and the private sector reactions to that so that they can be coordinated to joint benefit.
Mr. Schuessler, is this what your crisis manager would do? Is that what you envision them doing?
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, I thank you all for your testimony, and I'm grateful for you bringing expertise to us.
Thank you.
All right. Thank the ranking member. I'll proceed with my 5 minutes of questions. Mr. Kane, when I was within your written testimony, one of the things that really jumped out at me is when you said that Collins Pines, which owns 120,000 acres in the same basically geographic area where the Allegheny National Forest is located, that Collins Pines sustainably harvests the same amount as the Allegheny National Forest on a quarter of the acreage. And I was wondering to see if you could explain that a little bit. How's that possible?
That's, it's really interesting. I was actually went to Collins Pine to get permission to use that testimony before using it. And a little background of Collins Pine, T.D. Collins was one of the original timber barons of the Allegheny region, and he didn't sell his land to the National Forest. It's a great story, but they called him 10% Teddy, and when the National Forest bought that land, they were paying 50 cents an acre, and Teddy Collins wanted 55 cents, and he, by God, wasn't going to sell it. So his land, a lot of his land is contained within the boundaries of the Allegheny. And in 1995, the Collins Pine Company obtained the FSC certification. Those that aren't familiar with it, it's an international certification to assure that their lands are managed sustainably, both economically, socially, and environmentally. And their allowable cut, and they're currently harvesting on that land equal to what the Allegheny National Forest is producing, with a forestry staff of 9 people. And you know, it's because their forest, T.D. Collins didn't overharvest his forest, and you know, the family is a really unique. It's interesting to, if you research them, they're great people, and they're very much committed to sustainability, and they're currently harvesting that because it is a mature resource, and they're trying to balance their age classes. If you look at the Allegheny National Forest in their 1985 plan, they had a desired future forest condition. The 2005 plan is further away from that desired future forest condition than what the 85 plan was. And with the reduced harvest, that every year they fall farther and farther behind. That's why I used the slides, hopefully, that a picture would speak 1,000 words, showing that my last slide looked very similar to what the structure of the forest was in 1927, because it is in need of management. If we could fund the Allegheny adequately, use the stewardship program, because it appears that the unfounded lawsuits against the Allegheny for their silvicultural activities, you know, they're completely unfounded. They've not been significantly successful at all in their challenges to the Allegheny. In fact, the Allegheny has prevailed in essentially every lawsuit against the environmental challenge. And if they could just use the money that's available and reinvest that money into the federal system, it could be extremely sustainable and support the local economies through the 25% fund. It doesn't seem from a boots on the ground dirt forester that complicated, because we have to do it on private ground every day. But that's the story of Collins Pine. Their forest is mature, and they're capitalizing on it today to regenerate it in the future. There are other detailed challenges there, but the big broad brush approach, it's working for them. It's sustainable, and they're being monitored.
Very good. Thank you. Dr. Sample, outside of the general reauthorization, are there ways that we can improve upon stewardship contracting activities on Forest Service and BLM lands?
I think there are, and not just on the western lands that have been sort of a primary focus here. But because they are long-term contracts, and because they span across a lot of different kinds of activities, from road maintenance to streamside zone restoration, there's a lot of things that small businesses that are typical in these rural communities can do, and they can plan their activities over the 5-year, 10-year life of that contract, so that they can continue to invest in capacity. So, reauthorizing the act that passed in 2003, I think, would be the way to do that. It was, because it spanned across the entire national forest system, also included BLM lands. So I think that would be what I would recommend. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Schuessler. If Forest County had a chance to vote again on its countywide referendum to turn over its forests to the federal government, do you think they would do that again?
I don't believe that they would. I think it would be a dramatically different outcome.
You point out in your testimony that there are major issues such as declining quality of standing timber, costs, onerous roles. Can you discuss some of the roles that are detrimental to the industry and how each may affect different regions?
Well, if I understand you correct, how is the management of the national forest impacting the other regions? One thing I can outline for you, I did a chart, and it's in one of my exhibits there, is we had counties like your gentleman that wouldn't sell to the federal forest back in the 20s. They made the wise choice in the long run. And the reason is the chart reveals, and that's where I really believe that there's $100 million within the Schwamigan alone to be had just to the federal treasury by managing at those sustainable levels that those counties are currently doing. So you take the 11 counties, the 11 top counties that don't have national forest, and you put them head to head with the Schwamigan-Nicolet. There are actually fewer acres in those top 11 counties, but it's about a 3-to-1 margin in return as far as revenue coming out of those counties. And no one's clear-cutting their forests unless it's a popple stand or aspen stand where that's the kind of regenerative treatment that you do. This is sustainable management taking place. And the other thing I'd add to that is a couple of the counties, for example, wood counties, they really don't have the benefit of the northern hardwoods that we've got within the Schwamigan-Nicolet. If I add the 3 counties that have a little bit of national forest, like Langlade and Oconto to it, Oneida, it changes the number dramatically. It's probably well in advance of $100 million using those because of those species that exist within northern Wisconsin.
Yeah, thank you. And Dr. McKenna, based on your studies, do you believe that the Forest Service does an adequate job of accounting for its economic impact on a community by its management decisions? And if not, what do they need to consider?
We use a different technique so that we get different answers than they do, but they developed a very useful system called M-Plan that does the accounting. It's the incorporation of that accounting into the planning process. It seems to be where the breakdown is.
With M-Plan, your testimony indicated that economic models are utilized in NEPA and NFMA planning processes. You know, from your analysis, how are the M-Plan outputs used in decision making?
If we look at what these generate, all of these modeling processes give us a physical perturbation or biological perturbation, and then we can tell you jobs and income, and in our system we'll tell you where the jobs and income M-Plan does a mix. But it doesn't tell you directly how to increase that or decrease that. That's up to the planning process itself. One of the things that I have had to tell my clients regularly is that jobs and income do not seem to sway the resource allocation decision itself. There has been, in my experience, in the last year, 2 instances where it appears to have changed, where the job and income effects seem to influence the preferred alternative.
Well, thank you. And thank you to all 4 of you in the second panel for your expertise and your testimony, coming today to help us, prepare us to make better decisions. I now yield to the ranking member to make any closing remarks he has.
Again, thank you, Chairman, and congratulations on assuming this. You're the right person for this job, and I'm grateful. It's a good first hearing. Thank you, all 4 of you. It's good stuff to think about. You're a great resource for us. Please use our office now as things come forward to make sure we're being contacted. I would just highlight and give a thank you. I don't know if the 4 of you noticed, but Chief Tidwell came and listened to all of your testimony and stayed through this whole hearing. I can tell you from being around here that's an unusual and a very appreciated gesture and shows concern of hearing this. I think it bodes well for the future on this. I'm optimistic. As I said again, this is a legacy that's the envy of the world. We get things right, we can get it right again, and I'm seeing it in my state that it doesn't have to be an either or. You can manage these forests, you can have economic gain off those, we can look to the future on biomass and value-added products at the same time keeping that legacy of outdoor usage. So thank you all for being part of it. I yield back.
I thank the ranking member, and once again, thank all the panelists. The chief talked about put an emphasis on the importance of collaboration, working together, and we've got a lot of expertise here just in this room. So I know the subcommittee is committed to continue to look at forestry issues, and we all, I think we all share the same goals. So thank you so much to everyone. Under the rules of the committee, the record of today's hearing will remain open for 10 calendar days to receive additional materials and supplementary written response from witnesses to any question posed by a member. This hearing of the Subcommittee of Conservation, Energy, and Forestry is adjourned.